First is just to say I was delighted to have Heidi focus so much on the recent initiatives by the Abe government in Japan. I was on record both here and in Tokyo pushing very hard the Prime Minister that women's labor supply was the single biggest thing he could do for long-term growth prospects in Japan. And I agree with her that this is obviously not enough, but is a major step forward in a country that many did not expect that to happen. Just speaking from the personal experience on that, it is one of the things that I think was most profound and important about Heidi's remarks is to remind us that this isn't just about all the horrible oppression that some poor underdeveloped economies put on their women, although of course that is critical and key. It is as well in the US and in Japan and in many of the rich countries where potential is being squandered. And I remember viscerally when I was working in Germany after German reunification back in 92, 93, I wasn't as brave as Heidi, I didn't go further east, that there was a massive shift in women's labor force participation downwards after reunification because for all its faults, the Deutsche Democratic Republic, East Germany, had very actively promoted childcare, had very actively promoted leave, had very actively promoted women's equality in the workforce. And that there was a huge negative shock in Germany. Part of the reunification shock was because of that. So this is, I think, a very real issue and the kind of thing we confront. The second institutional matter, I would say, I did say welcome to the people who are here for the first time, and I hope this is not the last time by any means, but just to say not only in my personal work in Japan, but in this institution, we are committed to continuing to work on these issues. Right now, under working with Barbara Kochwar, Marcus Noland, and Arvind Subramanian from our research team, we're working with Ernst & Young on a large-scale project on sport and women's leadership around the world, jumping off the World Cup and the Olympics and trying to make that both a symbolic but also a substantive contribution, and we're very proud to be doing that. Anyway, the institutional plugs, sincere though they are nothing to compare to our next discussant, Dr. Namat Shafiq. Manoush is Deputy Managing Director of the IMF since April 2011. She's done an incredible variety of things in academia, in management, and policymaking. She was the youngest ever vice president at the World Bank, where she was in the hardcore area of managing the IFC. She spent some time as the permanent secretary of the UK Department for International Development. I can attest from my time in the UK that throughout the time she was there, DFID was seen as the gold standard, both for development agencies around the world, but also for a well-run department in the UK. And it is really my pleasure to have her here as a discussant of today's topic. Manoush.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's really hard to discuss a paper which you fundamentally agree with. So let me try and do something slightly different, which is to try and answer three questions which kind of take off from where Heidi left off. And I'm going to talk about three things. First, where are the missing women? Two, is it mostly fiscal? And three, what can the IMF do about it? So let me start with where are the missing women. Some of you may recall a very famous article that the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen wrote in 1991 in the New York Review of Books, which talked about 100 million missing women in the world. And the point he was making was that if you looked at the demographics, there were 100 million women in the world who were missing because they had been deprived of nutrition and health care as girls, and so they had died prematurely. And they became a symbol, that 100 million number became a symbol of the lack of equality in health and education. Now, while this problem still exists to some extent, probably one of the most remarkable stories of the last 20 years is the fact that we have essentially closed the gap in health and education for girls. The health gap is now about 96% between healthcare access for boys and girls, and in education, the gender gap is down to about 93% globally. And in fact, in many countries in the world, if you look at tertiary education, there are actually more girls in tertiary education than there are boys. Now, when I was a college student in the early 1980s, I remember writing an essay for one of my classes, which basically argued that once we had closed the gender gap in education, we were there in terms of equality, that everything else would fall out from having got girls globally access to the same levels of education as boys. But the fact is, 20 years on, the gap is still there, but it's changed. It's not, the girls are alive and they've been educated, but they're not in the labor market. So if you look at the gap in female labor force participation globally, it's about 60%. And if you look at the gap in political participation, it's only 20%. So in many ways, the new frontier for where the women are missing is in the labor market and in political power. So why are there hundreds and millions of missing women in the world's labor markets? Well, first, let me just say there's a sort of sequential logic to this. First, you have to keep them alive, and then you have to educate them, and then they're more likely to get jobs and have political power. So, we're on a journey, as they say, as the consultants say. We're on a journey. But that's not the whole story. One of the things that we discovered when we look across countries at different stages of development and different levels of per capita income is that, like in many things in economics, there's a Kuznets curve, as we call it. At different levels of if you plot countries on income and female labor force participation, it has a U shape. So what does that mean? That means at very low levels of per capita income, you have very high levels of female labor force participation because women have no option but to work. So not surprisingly, pretty high levels of female labor force participation in places like Africa. But then as countries get richer and go to sort of middle income status, what we now call the emerging markets, you see female labor force participation drop as families can afford to have women stay at home and take care of children. And then at higher levels of per capita income, it tends to go up again. So you have the highest levels of female labor force participation in the OECD countries. Now the question is then, what does it take to change that pattern, to bring forward increasing female labor force participation? And also, how do we explain that some countries are deviants on this U-shaped path as their incomes rise, countries like Japan or many countries in Southern Europe? So let me turn to the policy question, and that will be my second point, which is it's mostly fiscal. For those of you who are not aficionados of the joke, it is often joked that the acronym IMF stands for it's mostly fiscal, because whenever we see any problem, we say, aha, it's mostly fiscal. But in the case of women in economics, there is a huge role for fiscal policy in determining the patterns that we see in female labor force participation. Let me start with tax policies. We know that many countries discriminate in their tax policies on second earners, so that women who tend to be the second earners in many households, their marginal tax rate is higher as a result, or the household's tax rate is higher if there's a second earner. This is a big issue in the US, in France, in Portugal. Many countries offer tax credit for low-wage earners, which often are also women. Those countries tend to see more women participating in the labor force if you have lower tax rates or tax credits for low-wage earners. And then move to the area of expenditure policy, where parental leave policies deviate enormously from the extreme where in this country you get 0 weeks of parental leave mandated by government to a high of 162 weeks in a country like France. Many countries also link child benefits to female labor force participation. Access to childcare, affordable and high-quality childcare is key. Research has shown if you can bring childcare costs down by 50%, young mothers will increase their labor supply by 6.5% to 10%. Pension reforms that don't discriminate against maternity leave, investing in education and for women, obviously, and infrastructure that supports them, flexible work arrangements, and providing access to training and finance are all expenditure-type policies which can have huge impacts on whether or not women enter the labor market. Now, I have to say, it's not just fiscal. It's also probably cultural, but we don't do culture at the IMF, so I leave that to others to opine on. But I recently had to give a speech in Italy, and I noted that Italy has a highly educated female labor force. It has the lowest female labor force participation rate in the OECD. It also has the lowest birth rate. So the women aren't staying at home to take care of lots of babies as we traditionally thought of in Italy. And so clearly the question for Italian women might have something to do with that Italian men are not doing a great job of helping at home to enable their wives to be able to go and participate in the labor force. So there is obviously a cultural element to this, but we haven't got research on that at the IMF. Let me turn, though, to the role of the IMF and what we could do and what we are doing in this important agenda. Now, the IMF is famous for being an organization that sticks to its knitting, so to use a female metaphor. Our mandate is clearly macro and financial stability in the world. But for many countries, the issue that will determine their fiscal and their debt sustainability, as well as the stability of their financial systems, is growth. And that is the lens through which we will look at this issue of the role of women in economics, the critical role and the critical contribution they can make to economic growth. We recently looked at our Article 4s, which Heidi mentioned, which is our sort of annual report that we write on all the economies of the world. And as of now, 40% of them actually disaggregate labor market data by gender and talk about female labor force participation in some way. And a quarter of our program documents, where countries come to the IMF for programs, now look at the issue of female labor force participation. It was a particularly important issue in the Article 4 reports that we did on Japan, which was mentioned by Heidi and Adam, as well as on Germany and in Italy. And it's increasingly getting mentioned in some of the work we're doing on Southern European countries, for whom getting women into the labor force to support growth and recovery is a key issue. It's also obviously an issue in the Middle East and North Africa, which has the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world. But in addition to this work that we're doing with countries and with our interactions with authorities in those countries, we've also issued some recent thematic papers on a variety of topics. The role of female labor force participation in aging societies, for example, the work on gender budgeting, which was mentioned, and we shortly, hopefully in the next couple of months, hope to bring out a new paper on jobs and gender. So let me just close by congratulating Heidi on raising this issue and providing so much compelling evidence in support of it, and really just to reiterate the three key messages from me. The missing women they're alive, they're well, and they're educated, but they're missing from the labor market. So employment is really the new frontier for thinking about where women are missing. Second, the key to increasing female labor force participation is it's mostly fiscal. And three, the IMF can contribute to this agenda, not alone, but in partnership with others. And we think we have some pretty important things to say and some pretty powerful levers to help advance this very important agenda. Thank you very much.
It's so much better when she says it instead of just saying, it's about jobs, which is, of course, the eternal Washington refrain. We move to another legend and inspiring figure, Carly Fiorina, who brings us a perspective from the world of business and very US-based, but obviously internationally cognizant. All of you, I think, know Carly as chairperson and chief executive officer of Hewlett-Packard from 1999 to 2005, where she had an incredible record of mergers and of success. But she's also been, as I hope many of you know, extremely active in a number of NGOs and causes related to today's topic. She's chairman of Good 360, the world's largest product philanthropy organization. She's been involved with Vital Voices. She's the founder of the One Woman Initiative and serves as a global ambassador for Opportunity International. She's been a founding supporter of the African Leadership Academy. And she has tried to bring business insight into government, which may be even one notch harder than what we do, as a chairman of the CIA's External Advisory Board and of the Advisory Group for Transformational Diplomacy at the Department of State. I got to know Charlie just a little bit through the work she and I did together with some others on the Task Force on Inclusive Capitalism that Don Barton and Lynn Rothschild were running. And it was very exciting for me to hear her voice and discussion live up to what I had heard about through the press. So it's a particular pleasure for me to get to invite her to our stage for the first time. Thank you, Carly.
Well, thank you, Adam, so much for that gracious introduction. Good afternoon, and thanks to you and to the Peterson Institute for convening this important group to discuss this critical topic. And I must say, I'm really honored to follow both Manoush and Heidi, both of whom gave really excellent presentations here today. As Manoush says, it's hard to be a discussant. By the way, that's a new term to me, a discussant. Someone who discusses, I presume, but it's hard sometimes to be a discussant when you agree so violently with everything that has been said before you. But perhaps I can add to the discussion by taking a slightly different point of view. And the point of view I'd like to take is, honestly, why are we still discussing this at all? Why is it that we are still trying to make the case? As I look out around this audience, I see both the potential of this conversation and the problem with this conversation. This is still mostly a female audience. Every speaker has been a woman. Thank you, Adam, a wonderful man, for getting us together. But still, somehow, a lot of women in positions of power or not are spending a lot of time, decades I would argue, trying to make the case that women being allowed to fulfill their potential is good for everyone. So why? Why is it we still are having to make the case? Let me suggest 3 or 4 reasons, some of which might be provocative or even controversial. First of all, let me confirm and punctuate everything that Manoush and Heidi said. The data is actually crystal clear. The data has been clear for a long time. It is not that the new research that Heidi referenced and Manoush is engaged in, it's not that this research doesn't add to our understanding of the problem and the opportunity. It of course does, but it fundamentally doesn't tell us anything new. Every problem that exists in the world is made better when women get to play. The data's clear. If you want to reduce the incidence of AIDS, you must engage women. If you want to resolve conflicts, you must engage women. If you want to reduce the rate of poverty, you must engage women. If you want to grow economies, you must engage women. If you want to make democratic reforms, you must engage women. The list goes on and on and on. If you want to solve problems and make progress, women must be more engaged. And yet we're still making the case. So why? Because, reason number 1, I think there is a lack of outrage. And I start with this on a day when Nelson Mandela lies in critical condition in a South African hospital. Why do I start with him? Because remember for a moment the justifiable, and indeed many would argue long overdue, outrage throughout the world that was directed at the apartheid regime in South Africa. Remember that outrage, the political outrage, the economic consequences, the virtual shunning of this society because of its subjugation of a huge group of people. Where is a similar outrage? And lest you think they are not comparable, I disagree with Manoush slightly in terms of the amount of progress we've made, although we've clearly made a great deal of progress. 70% of the people living on less than $2 a day are women. In this country, 1 in 6 people live in poverty, and the burden of poverty rests most heavily on women and their children, and that is true here. It is true in every country around the world. There are still millions of missing women. They may be children that are aborted simply because they are female. They may be babies who are left exposed to die simply because they are female. They may be young girls who are sold into slavery, sexual slavery, but there is a horrific degree of subjugation of women that still goes on, and for which there is, in my view, shockingly little outrage. Second reason that we're still trying to make the case: there is a big difference between women's issues and the issue of women being permitted to fulfill their potential for the benefit of all. Women's issues in this country and elsewhere are political issues, and they are frequently divisive political issues. Susan B. Anthony, Emily's List, pro-life, pro-choice. These are things that are described routinely as women's issues. They are divisive issues, and they are used to rally political support, one party or candidate against another. Even some of the solutions that are put forward from a legislative point of view turn out to be quite controversial. On the one hand, and I'm not taking a position on any of these points of view, but some would argue Lilly Ledbetter is an absolutely vital step in ensuring equality for pay in the workplace. Others would say it merely extends the statute of limitations for one group of people in filing suit. It doesn't matter what you think about that. What matters, at least for this discussion, is that is it a political, divisive issue, which causes women and men to argue with each other about women's issues. It's not just that they're political issues, these women's issues. It's not just that they are divisive issues, they are wedge issues. Third, we must say it. The issue of women, their inability to fulfill their potential everywhere, is the issue of power. Women's rights, or the absence of those rights, is cloaked in many things. It can be cloaked in culture, it can be cloaked in religion, it can be cloaked in tradition. It can be cloaked in a group of people saying, you know, I don't know her, I've never worked with her, it's too big a risk to go with her. But all of those things, honestly, are about power. And it is human nature that those who have power want to keep it. It is just human nature. So whether we are talking about the fact that, yes, it is huge progress that we should celebrate, that when I became the CEO of HP, I was the first woman to lead a Fortune 50 company. And with that first status came a degree of scrutiny and criticism that was unlike anything I had been prepared for, and certainly unlike something a man would have received. And today, the 2 largest technology companies in the world are both run by women. It's a tremendous achievement, and yet, today in the boardroom in this country, still less than 20% of board members are women. Less than 20%. The number is far fewer in Europe. And of course, there are horror stories around the world of women's inability to gain access even to the most fundamental rights, the right to justice. We celebrate that women are being educated around the world, and yet A young girl is stoned to death in Pakistan because she dares to be educated. We look at pictures of women in Afghanistan completely covered, but nevertheless holding up their purple fingers saying that they voted, and yet a beautiful young woman's nose and ears are chopped off in retribution for her daring to believe that she could be an equal member of society. Change is hard. And change comes very slowly sometimes. So when you add all that up, a lack of outrage about things that are without question outrageous, a set of issues characterized as women's issues that turn out to divide us, not unite us, a protection of power, and the rationale for why change is hard, whether it's risk aversion or cultural or religious, you add all that up, and it's no wonder that Heidi made the point that actually nobody sometimes really wants to talk about this. It's a difficult subject for people to delve into. These are sometimes delicate issues, divisive issues, they're threatening issues sometimes. They're viewed as interfering in the normal workings of policy and politics. I think part of what we need to do is to reframe the question. I think we should stop talking about this as a woman's issue. I think the reality is this: the more that girls and women are permitted to fulfill their potential, whatever that potential is, the more problems we solve, the more growth we achieve, the more progress we make, the better our communities are, our companies are, our world is. And the data is crystal clear, whether it's micro or macro. Micro, I happen to be engaged in micro lending around the world. When Mohammed Yunus, the pioneer of micro lending, Mohammed Yunus, as many of you know, started out trying to lend money to men. Why? Because that's just how you did it. You lended money to men. But what he found out was that in too many cases, they were bad credit risks. They invested the money poorly, and so he began out of necessity to invest in women. And today, women represent 97% of all the microloans in the world. Why? Because women invest more wisely. They invest in their children, they invest in their communities, they build businesses that build opportunities for others, not just themselves. When women and girls are permitted to fulfill their potential, everyone's life gets better. That is the issue. Men have to talk about this too. Congratulations, Adam, and to the Peterson Institute, and to all of you who are here who are men. And it isn't about men versus women. It is about the reality that women, half the population in the world. Women are the most impoverished people in the world, the most subjugated people in the world, and the most underutilized economic resource in the world. In every country, in every nation, in every corner of the world. And here we are in a world with so much to do, so many problems, so many opportunities. I reject the pessimistic economist view that we will not grow, but we will not grow unless everyone, 50% of our population, has the opportunity to fulfill their potential. So I think as important as it is that we create special commissions and special positions to highlight this, that we will have succeeded when there is sustained outrage about the state of the world on this topic, where we stop using women's issues as a way of distracting from the larger issue, which is about power, its retention, people's unwillingness or uneasiness about relinquishing power, and most especially when everyone, men and women, will say, you know what, we have a lot of problems. Disease, illiteracy, conflict, poverty. We have a lot of problems. And in every case, the way to make more rapid progress on that problem is to engage women. The data is crystal clear. Now I think what it takes is outrage, sustained conversation, and a willingness to acknowledge that the solution is sitting right in front of us. Thank you so very much.